Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Dr. Jadi Santana Win, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. Hopefully, we can get through this presentation without much technical difficulties. I think I tested everything out, but the reason I'm presenting on this is because the United States is a destination for a lot of LGBTQI immigrants and asylum seekers from around the world who come here fleeing persecution in their home countries. And these sexual and gender minority immigrants also have unique needs that are often unaddressed by the immigration and asylum system, as well as by our mental health and medical health systems. So hopefully today, my goal is to increase your familiarity with specific challenges and barriers faced by LGBTQI people who are in need of mental health services from us, increase your awareness of how special needs and immigrant identities of LGBTQI individuals may intersect with their mental health needs, and enhance your ability to offer sensitive, affirmative, culturally relevant, and effective treatment to these individuals. I like to start always with a bit of history and statistics so that people can have a context of where we are coming from and how far we have come, but also how much more we have to go. So it was in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association replaced homosexuality with sexual orientation disturbance in the DSM for people in conflict with their sexual orientation. That's the way that it was described, in conflict with their sexual orientation. It was not until 1987 that homosexuality completely fell off of the DSM. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization only removed homosexuality from its ICD classification with the publication of the ICD-10 in 1992. So that's very, very recent. Although ICD-10 still carries the construct of ego-dystonic sexual orientation, just so you know. In 2013, gender identity disorder was dropped from the DSM, and a new condition called gender dysphoria was added, whereas the World Health Organization only announced that it will no longer categorize being transgender as a mental disorder in May of 2019. When it comes to immigration and nationality, queer immigrants were first banned from the United States in 1952 through the Immigration and Nationality Act, which banned anyone with psychiatric personality or psychopathic personality from immigrating to the United States. The bill's author always intended for gay people to be excluded under this clause, but the ban was strengthened when the INA was revised in 1965 to explicitly affirm that sexual deviation was a form of psychopathic personality. The law came in the wake of the Lavender Scare, a period in which the federal government attempted to root out potential subversive queer government workers as part of the Cold War effort. In 1966, a judge argued against the law, saying that it would ban people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and perhaps more than a few members of legislative bodies. That was the way it was worded in the court decision. Despite this, the policy remained in place until 1990, when Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1990 to revise and reform the U.S. immigration system. And U.S. Representative Barney Frank, who served from until 2013, from 1981 to 2013, and was the country's first openly gay congressman, co-wrote this act in lifting the ban on gay and lesbian immigrants by simply not including the exclusionary language in the law. So it wasn't that it was revised to be inclusive, it's simply he rewrote it so that it would not include the exclusionary language. The same year, the United States began accepting asylum seekers on the grounds of persecution for sexual orientation, although it has done so inconsistently. There's an estimated 1.3 million LGBT adult immigrants in the United States. More than 1 in 10 LGBTQ adults are immigrants. 3% of adult immigrants identify as LGBT. Nearly 1/3 of LGBT immigrants are undocumented. 61.8% of LGBT undocumented immigrants are male. Almost half of these immigrants are between the ages of 18 and 29. And like their undocumented counterpart, LGBT documented immigrants are more often male and younger compared to all documented adults in the United States. So I think that this is really important to note because this shows us how many people actually fall into this category and how they are part of our communities, and maybe they are invisible to us in many ways when they come to us, but they are very present. So the idea that, and when I work with people in the community, when I work with providers in the community, both in mental health and other social services and medical services, many times when I ask how many of your patients or consumers are LGBTQ, many say we don't get many of those. But as we can see, they are there and they are in large numbers. So the likelihood that you don't have any of those is is improbable, and more likely that you're just simply not aware that they are there. And so that to me speaks to a person not feeling safe enough to come out to you, self-disclose, or that your services simply aren't tracking this information or aren't asking the right questions. So hopefully we'll be able to repair some of that. There's some important terms that I want to go over. I like to make sure that we are all on the same page when we are using language. Sex assigned at birth is the assignment based on anatomical expression of gender. Although many people call it biological sex, it's really important to understand that this biological sex, is not binary. It's not just male and female. There is also intersex and indeterminate. And this is evident, for example, with intersex, and it's caused by a number of different conditions that may or may not be evident at birth. When the genitals are formed visibly differently, it is more evident, but it's not always that clear. When we're talking about gender identity, we're talking about an individual's internal sense of sexual identity on a male-female continuum. So their gender identity is based on their male-female continuum. So that's very binary. And we're going to talk about non-binary as well. Sexual orientation is an individual's emotional or physical attraction towards another of the same or opposite gender. And the way that I like to describe it to families when I'm working with them is this is not a choice. This is when you see someone and you're like, oh, right? Like you just that attraction, that catching of the breath, that's not something that we do willingly. That's something that is an automatic experience for most of us. When it comes to gender expression, we're talking about how one outwardly expresses one's gender identity or how one wishes to appear in a social setting. As per when it comes to gender expression, I want you to think about like dress, hair, everything that is an outward, physical, visible sign of gender expression. There are women who may dress more feminine with makeup and lipstick and ruffles and dresses and high heels, and others who may feel more comfortable in a dress shirt and slacks. And so when we think about that, these are different ways of representing gender. And the same thing with men. If you think about men who may wear eyeliner and nail polish and perhaps even skirts or high heels versus men who dress traditionally male. Identity refers to our internal perceptions of ourselves, defined as we have seen in as I've talked about just now, but also when we talk about culture, it includes our ethnic background, our cultural heritage, our race, and many other forms of identity that can mean, our abilities. If you identify as, for example, as a deaf person or a blind person, all of those are different identities that people hold. If you identify along a religious spectrum, if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're Jewish, any of that, those are also identities. And so when we talk about intersectionality, and you're going to hear me talk about intersectionality today, talking about multiple forms of power and oppression that are operating simultaneously based on those different identities. So including class, gender, race, sexuality, and other forms of identity. And a person can have, as you can see, multiple identities, some of which they will have and hold more power because of that identity, whereas some of their other aspects of their identity may be they hold less power and experience oppression or discrimination as a result. I think most of us are familiar with the letters, but I want to make sure that we go over this. There is lesbian and gay, and this is people who are sexually attracted to the same gender. We have bisexual, people who are either of either gender who are attracted to both genders. Transgender people are individuals who inwardly identify as being a gender other than, and I put here biological sex, but really as their sex assigned at birth, right? And questioning are individuals who are consciously wondering about their sexual orientation or gender assignment. The Q also in LGBTQ also stands for queer, and you will hear me use the word queer at times. Queer is a terminology that used to be a pejorative term that has been adopted by the LGBTQI community to be inclusive of all who identify within a sexual orientation or gender minority. And so when you hear me speak of queer, I'm talking about sexual or gender minority, I say maybe. I think it's really important to recognize that these letters refer to those minorities in the total population, but they are not necessarily all the same. And so they all get lumped together because they have to deal with sex, sexuality, and gender in some way. These letters are not pathologies, but identities, and they are central to a person's being in understanding of who they are. And I think that sometimes a lot of people argue about like, why do we need all these labels and all these letters? Because they're aspects of a person's identity and it helps them understand themselves better. And so the reason the plus is in the name is because there are many others. And I think that that allows us to be inclusive of how people want to define themselves or identify themselves in a way that is more congruent with the way that they see themselves in their own lived experiences. And I think it's really important that not necessarily that I want you to go and learn about every one of the letters and identities, but that we are open to understanding what each one of these identities mean to the individual clients that we are working with. And so that brings me to intersex, which is about an individual being born with various combinations of sexual anatomy. And so there is a total number of people whose bodies, the total number of people whose bodies differ from the standard male or female that is assigned at birth is about 1% of, it's about 1 in 100 births. So it's about 1% of children who are born with chromosomes, hormones, or genitalia or other sex characteristics that are not exclusively male or female as defined by the medical establishment in our society. In most cases, these children are at no medical risk, but most are assigned a binary sex identity, male or female, by their doctors or families. And it's really important to recognize how common it is because, again, the only times when we know that there is quote unquote a problem is when there is an outward expression biologically of the genitalia that looks different than what is expected. However, remember that not all sex organs are developed at birth. And so when a lot of people go through that secondary sexual development in puberty and those secondary sexual hormones are released into the body, the rest of the person's sexual organs get developed, and this might not be the same as what we were expecting. And so, for example, I have worked with people and have known people in the community and who work as allies and also as educators in the community who grew up very traditional, who male, for example, the person that I'm thinking about specifically, and race had normal anatomy at birth and external anatomy at birth, and was raised as a male, and there were never any concerns except that around the time of puberty this young person developed different kind of facial structure, like more fatty tissue around the chest and around the the hips, but nothing that was obvious. It like that would say like, you're developing breasts or anything like that. However, the most concerning aspect was that this person started developing these abdominal cramps regularly, not every month, but very regularly. There were a lot of exams and there was nothing concerning. There were no, stomach issues that could be identified, lots of tests, but nothing was ever found why this boy was having these stomach cramps, semi-regularly with no prompt. And then they would also disappear without any intervention. It wasn't until this person got married and they were trying to have children that they went for evaluations for why they were not being successful, that they discovered that he had a uterus. And so at that point, this person's sense of self and identity was, he was thrown for a loop, and he had to make certain decisions about himself and explore that. And in therapy, he was able to figure out that he felt more comfortable. She felt more comfortable with a female identity. And at that point, she transitioned. And then again, she was already married. And so that was another challenge that the person experienced. So again, I say all of this because many people are going to come to us with a certain sense of something was wrong. So I knew something was off early on. And sometimes it's going to be something that it's biologically happening to them, and other part times it's not. But intersex is a very real experience for a lot of people. 1 in 100 births is still a lot of people. We just don't know it because it's not something that everybody, even the own person or their own family, is aware that it's happening. Not unless we were going to check everybody's chromosomes and hormones and internal sex organs every time that baby is born. So when it comes to cisgender, since I already explained these other letters, I want to include cisgender, is a person whose biological sex matches their gender identity. And so then there's also people who are gender non-binary, this is an umbrella term for gender identities that are not exclusively masculine or feminine. They view gender as a spectrum that falls outside of that binary. And so you'll see a representation in a little bit. And lastly, I will be touching on the coming out process. And coming out is the point at which the person decides to affirm their sexual or gender identity to themselves and or to others. And so that's important to remember, that it includes coming out to oneself first and then to others. I want to share the gender unicorn. This is one of my favorite models, and it is a model. It shows us how complex gender and sexuality are in our society. You are free to use it, and you can find it. If you Google the gender unicorn, it's free to use for educational purposes, and so feel free to use it with your clients, the families, and the individuals with whom you work. This model is not a depiction of how an idealized or utopian society might construct gender, nor is it prescriptive, suggesting that gender should be a certain way. It is not a diagnostic tool to be used or applied to other people. It is not a comprehensive model of sexuality or sexual orientation. It's just something to help us kind of visualize what this is. And so you can see over here that at the top is gender identity, which is a person's sense of self. And you can see that this exists in the mind. This is an idea. And there are 3 different slides. Remember that we talked about that binary. It's not just a single slide from one end to the other, but rather 3 different slides of from 0 to very feminine, from 0 to very male, and from 0 to very, whatever other gender the person identifies with. And so you can see how each one of these may be at different points, and that combination will look different for each person. How feminine do you feel? How masculine do you feel? And how much other do you feel? Gender expression is similar, right? But it has to do with that external outside. And you can see that represented by the little dots over here on the left. And sex assigned at birth is identified as female, male, or other / intersex. And that is represented down here around the genital area. And so that shows us that, again, that's only based on sex assigned at birth. It's only based on external genitalia at time of birth. And there, as far as physical attraction, that is represented up here in the chest, in the heart area. And you can see that people can be strongly or not at all as attracted to women, strongly or not at all attracted to men, and strongly or not at all attracted to other genders. And since there are many gender identities, there can be many other people to whom a person can be attracted. And emotional attraction, so physical attraction has to do with sex and who I want to have sexual contact with, whereas in physical contact with, whereas emotional attraction, it's similar, except that it has to do exclusively with our feelings and whether or not romantically I can feel attracted to and attached to another person, even if physically I do not desire contact with that person or with any people. And those people we refer to as asexual. Just a small reminder, quick reminder that identity, right? This identity does not equal expression, does not have to equal that sex assigned at birth, and that gender does not equal sexual orientation, or does not tell us what a person's sexual orientation is going to be. Quickly, let's talk about the risk factors. There's a variety of personal and social factors that influence the risk of developing mental illness in sexual and gender minority immigrants, starting with some of the pre-migration factors such as victimization history. A key risk factor in the development of mental illness is their experience of discrimination or violence in their sending countries, both from community members, families, and the state. Studies show that LGBTQ asylum seekers experience higher rates of sexual trauma and endure verbal and physical abuse in their home countries, which often begins early in their lives. Organizations that work with these populations noted that for trauma survivors in particular, access to mental health services is critical. And so many of these people have experienced a lot of trauma before coming to us. The criminalization and persecution of their identities is also another pre-migration factor. There are some sexual and gender minorities who come from countries where their queer identity was criminalized to the extent of the death penalty. For most people, it's not that severe, but there might be prison time or forced medical treatment. And they are used to hiding their true sexuality or gender identity, which means that then they may not feel safe disclosing to us simply because they're not used to having to do so, right? And I want to skip forward just quickly to show you these sexual orientations laws in the world. And this is a map that was created by ILGA. ILGA World is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. And in June of 2020, they launched its world map on sexual orientation laws in 20 languages. So if you go to their website, if you want copies of this map in other languages, they have this in 20 different languages that you can download. And this speaks to the legal, the legal protections or lack thereof for people who have different sexual orientations. And it goes all the way from the blue. The darkest blue indicates there are constitutional protections and legal recognition of families. And the darkest red indicates the death penalty or legal barriers to exercise any rights having to do with sexual orientation. Then they also have another map that is the legal gender recognition. And this one ranges from self-identification and the options for surgery to all the way to a sterilization or not, required, and no possibility of transitioning in any way. And this one is more recent. This one is from April 2024, as you can see here. So let's go back to our slide. And so it's important to recognize that we need to know where our consumers are coming from so that we understand what it was like to live and grow up in a country with such laws and with, what kind of freedoms do they have. Now, just because a person comes from a country where there might be laws and freedoms available or protections available legally does not mean that they will not have experienced victimization in their home countries, because there are family beliefs and there are religious beliefs that could potentially also cause harm and lead to victimization. There's also individual people who can cause harm and victimize folks. The immigration event itself can create a lot of trauma. There's the process of detention and the fear of deportation are huge for immigrants who are in the process of, trying to adjust their status. So they may be fearing that they will face deportation from the United States, which would then send them back to a country where, again, they may have no freedoms or be penalized for having a gender or sexual identity that falls outside of the norm. Across the United States, there are privately run facilities, detention centers, where people who are entering the country undocumented are held, or people who are seeking asylum. LGBTQ immigrants and transgender immigrants in particular are at greater risk of harassment and abuse in these detention centers, and they are frequently not housed in sections of their preferred gender identity. Although, and talk a little bit about this in a bit, but they are many times separated from the general population, which puts them in isolation. And we know the dangers and harms of long periods of isolation when people are incarcerated or detained. A survey on sexual and gender minority immigrants detained by ICE and Border Patrol found that approximately 1/3 of participants reported sexual abuse, physical assaults, or sexual harassment while in detention due to their LGBTQ identity. Nearly all of the participants reported being targets of homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, racist, or other verbal and nonverbal abuse by ICE and Border Patrol. And that included threats of violence and assault from other detainees as well. Nearly half of the participants interviewed reported new or increased mental health symptoms while in detention, including hives, panic attacks, mental health crisis, flashbacks, and self-harm. Roughly half of the participants were subject to solitary confinement, as I explained earlier. More than a quarter of the survey participants reported that ICE or Border Patrol separated them from their loved ones, whether it was a partner, a spouse, or a sibling. And so the detention centers are particularly traumatic for people who are LGBTQ, but also the fear of deportation. And so when I speak about the fear of deportation, I think this brings me to the structural violence of the status adjustment process for these people. There's an ever-present fear that their petitions are going to be rejected and they'll be returned to the home countries that they have fled. For many, this means that even if they had not been victimized yet, if they self-identified and that information is now public knowledge, they will be in danger when they return. And so there's also fear that even if they are not in danger, that the families that where they lived, the people that took care of them or helped take care of them, the community that they were a part of, will no longer receive them and will shun them or reject them. Additionally, proving a person's sexual and gender minority identity to successfully claim asylum on this basis ignores cultural differences in identity formation, expression, as well as their history of trauma and violence from the state. People may not be able to have concrete proof or credible evidence, as is stated in legal terms, credible evidence of this identity, because they may never have had a same-sex partner, or the person that they were in a relationship with is also closeted and is not free to confirm the relationship. Or they may not have been able, for example, if they are a trans person, they may not have been able to transition socially or participated in community organizations that were for sexual or gender minorities in their home because, again, either fear of violence from the state or persecution, or because of fear of rejection and hate crimes and things like that from the community or from their family members. There are also post-migration factors, so experiences of discrimination and hate crimes. The rates of anti-LGBTQ violence in the country, even, I mean, again, people flee their home countries many times because they are looking for a refuge, but even so, the rates of anti-LGBTQ violence remains consistent in this country, with more than 2,000 total incidents reported, with a substantial increase in severity of that violence that is reported. Transgender women, particularly, if they are people of color, and gay men face the highest risk of homicide in our country still to this day. Fewer survivors are reporting hate violence to the police, and those reporting are being met with increased police hostility. When it comes to English language acquisition, having English language gives us access to the dominant culture. And so if someone has difficulty accessing services in English, in their native language, and are not dominant in the English language, then they will have limited resources, and also will be limited to only accessing services in places where their native their native language is spoken. And so if that is the case, then that means that they have to seek services from locations where there are other people who share the cultural background and perhaps beliefs from which they are running. And so those post-migration factors can create additional barriers, which we'll be talking about as well. And then there's a social isolation. As I mentioned, there is rejection by family many times when the person comes out. There is, even if there's no rejection, they may be separated from their family, their support system, by virtue of having left the home country. For those who are seeking asylum, many cannot work in the early stages of asylum process, and they may not have access to financial support from the community programs that typically provide support, or from family members back home or even in the United States, including when they are in detention centers, where you can go have someone from your family kind of vouch for you and say you can stay with them so you won't be homeless. They may not have family that's willing to do that because they are rejecting of the person's LGBTQI identity. Research shows that LGBTQ youth who experience high levels of rejection from their families during adolescence, when compared to those who experience little or no rejection, were more than 8 times as likely to have attempted suicide, more than 6 times as likely to report high levels of depression, more than 3 times as likely to use illegal drugs, and more than 3 times as likely to be at risk for HIV or other STDs by the time that they reach their early 20s. And so if you think about those numbers here in the United States, you can imagine what that might be like from a country where there might be fewer resources and more rejection. Social isolation is also a big concern for the elderly. When a person's partner, because of age, may have died, or even if they lived a long time closeted, coming to the United States, it's not going to be as easy to become part of a community that is often tends to lean towards, a lot of social activities that are aimed towards youth, or, partying clubs and things like that. So it's not going to be the kind of support. It's not going to be as easy to create supports. However, there are fantastic organizations in the Philadelphia area that work with aging LGBTQI populations. Elderly people also who transition may lose access to children that, who were part of their, who were their children, but who may become rejecting of them once they transition or come out, if you will. There's also individual factors. As I mentioned, the HIV positive status. Nearly half of participants in one of the studies reported having, in the study that I mentioned about detention centers, reported having their sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV status, or other confidential medical information disclosed in custody without their consent. And the majority of survey participants in that survey reported neglect, medical neglect, or denial of medical HIV treatment while they were in detention. And so they may not have access to HIV positive or treatment where they were coming from, but they may have encountered barriers even if they were already receiving treatment prior to coming here. And again, many of these medical services will be provided in community centers within the immigrant community from which they come. And so there may be shame or fear or stigma about accessing those services as well. There may be pre-existing medical or mental health conditions as well. Some of the most common ones that, according to research, is depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidality, and alcohol and substance misuse. And the prevalence rates for all of these compared to non-sexual minority immigrants are considerably higher, suggesting that having those multiple minority identity has a cumulative impact on the prevalence of mental illness in this population. The study, one of the studies found that the prevalence of PTSD ranged from 70% to 100% for the population from the participants that they interviewed. LGBTQ teens and young adults have one of the highest rates of suicide attempts. However, there's also hope, because a lot of these people, and this is one of the best protective factors, that come from countries and cultures where there are religious beliefs against suicidality, tend to have lower risk of suicidality, but also when they come here, they come hoping there is hope for a better life. And so that hope often helps to combat some of this suicidal risk. When I mentioned intersectionality earlier, but a person with the intersectional identity that includes multiple identities that are oppressed, such as being Black, being female, being poor, low level of education, all of those identities, the more of those identities that a person holds, the more risk factors that they also hold. And so I think making sure that we are aware of all of those identities. There's also, religious persecution and so on, but anything that can lead to prejudice, discrimination, oppression, or barriers to needed resources is considered to increase risk. And now we're going to watch this video. Anybody, let me know if you cannot hear it.
My name is Sasha. I came from far east of Russia, from Vladivostok city. When you're growing up in Russia, you don't think about homosexuality at all. It doesn't exist. I remember I was 5 years old and my mom approached me and said, "Sasha, do you know at work we have one guy, we think he's homosexual." During all my childhood, I knew that gay is something in the category of assassination, of bad people. It's basically contagious. I perfectly remember that morning when I told to my parents that I'm gay. First thing what my mom told me was, "You just killed me." And I remember she approached me and she kissed me and she fixed my blanket and she said, "We will treat you And that was the most painful moment I ever had with my parents. It was the caress and tenderness and misunderstanding at the same moment. He wasn't looking at me as a son anymore. She was looking at me as a person whom you need to treat. The first thing you feel is you're powerless. You're full of fear. You're starting to not to believe people. You're starting to suspect everybody, that everybody is against you. I can tell you what consequences is even if you're not officially gay, but people are suspect that you're gay. I remember one guy just approached me and he wanted to make fun of me, and he started to pretended that he's fucking me from behind, and everybody laughed at it. That's the way he wanted to show that he can dominate me, and I'm a gay guy and he can do whatever he wants with me. I'm still thinking right now, one day I'm going back to Russia. How am I going to behave? This is a very interesting question for myself. Do I have to do a special training for myself how to behave as a straight person and say like, hey, I'm straight?
The Chinese community in the Philippines is very small, so anything taboo we just don't talk about, or I don't know, maybe ignore. I recently moved from Manila right after college. I just wanted like a change of scenery and to explore more cultures, and I feel like New York has that to offer. I definitely feel like there's more pressure in the Philippines to hide what you really feel and stick to the norm. You know, like have a stable, especially the Chinese, like stability is their main word. Stable job, stable wife, stable family. So now that I came here, I started exploring, experimenting with makeup. My first ever bra was like 6 months in. I went to Victoria's Secret and I was just like, can you measure me? My mom just recently visited me for a week. And the last night we shared, she made me sit down next to her on the couch. And it was like, there's just this video about homosexuality that I want you to see. I was like, Mommy, do you seriously want to spoil our last night? Because I know she loves me, and the only part of her that can't accept me truly is the Christian part. When my dad finally found out, he keeps emailing me saying, try your best to change your gender, blah, blah, blah. He would email me news about transsexuals being killed and abused and he would just be like, change now or regret it later, so stuff like that. New York City is the best. Gays are celebrated here. Flamboyant gays, straight acting gays. I'm kind of gay. I didn't know that I could be this much loved by so many people, romantically and like platonically. Like, it's just so amazing, the feeling of security when I got here.
My name is Arya and I'm from India. I came to US 2 months ago. The reason coming here just because I wanna be with my boyfriend. Nobody in my family knows that I'm gay. Being a closeted gay man is like that you have to pretend that you're not what you are in front of your friends, your colleagues, your relatives. I used to flirt with girls so that they won't think that I'm gay. I would be getting a choice not to be gay. I would definitely not choose to be gay. Family may accept you what you are, but when it comes to society, you never know who from where would say anything bad about you, and it would hurt your parents, it would hurt your family, and it's all because of you. You never intended to hurt your family, but you did it. But here in US, especially in New York, we are allowed to marry a guy. A guy can marry a guy, a girl can marry a girl. That's the only problem that I have, that I have to hide this. The most important thing in my life that I'm going to do, like I am getting married to my boyfriend. I have to hide it from my parents. But for me, they don't know, and even if I tell them, I don't think they would ever accept it and would come here. But there are things that we have to decide on our own, just to live your life the way you want. So I'm happy here. And if I get married to my boyfriend, it's like I'm the happiest man. But at the same time, I have this feeling in my mind that, I wish my parents would be here.
All right. So you can see 3 different presentations and some of the concerns that immigrants experience, even if they feel safer being being themselves and expressing their identities, their sexual and gender identities fully once they arrive in the United States. There is still a significant battle internally and about who they truly are and how to continue to be connected to their families and to the country of origin, and how to feel accepted when they are participating in their cultural milieu. And so I mentioned a little bit about barriers as we were talking earlier about risk factors, but I want to make sure that we go over them. The primary barrier to utilization is mistrust and fear. And this is fear of discrimination, fear of homophobia, fear of transphobia, and heterosexism, that assumption that partners are always of the opposite sex and that I'm going to have to explain if that's not the case. So there's that invisible identity. If we were in person, I do an identity activity that I really enjoy, but it's very powerful about really identifying, picking some identities that are really central to who you are, and then having to give one up. And many times when I do this exercise, when people have to give one up, they really struggle and they feel anger towards me. They say that they're like, don't make me have to give one up, because that part of myself is really important. And so many times we recreate that within our agencies, within our communities, unintentionally, simply because if we are heterosexual, then we're not necessarily aware of how we are sending that message, simply by not being inclusive enough with our language or with our practices. In fear of microaggressions, which are very re-traumatizing, and microaggressions are considered brief and everyday slights or insults and indignities or denigrating messages that impact individuals who identify as being from a marginalized or non-mainstream community. These can be intentional or unintentional. They can be verbal or nonverbal. They can be grounded, in our beliefs, but many times our implicit biases. And the more intersecting identities, when I talked about that intersectionality. So when I talked about intersectionality, the more intersectional identities that we have, those intersectional identities will expose us to more microaggressions, because not only am I experiencing microaggressions perhaps about my race, about my gender, but also about my sexual orientation. And even if the other people are not aware of my sexual orientation, we will hear things like, that's so gay, right? Or we will hear jokes about gay people or about trans people. And all of those can be microaggressions. Research shows from Mental Health America, this was from Mental Health America, if anybody wants to get resources and data, 1/5 of LGBT individuals in the United States reported withholding information about their sexual practices from their doctors or other healthcare professionals. 30% of trans individuals reported postponing or avoiding medical care when sick or injured due to discrimination or disrespect. Over 30% avoid preventative care. The stigma and lack of cultural sensitivity and unconscious reluctance to address sexuality hampers effectiveness of care if we are not willing to have these conversations openly and directly, simply because we feel uncomfortable. It's important that we get comfortable with it. The way that we get comfortable with it may be through supervision, through additional training, but we have to get comfortable asking these questions, even of people who present as straight. And you heard it from 2 of those people who were in the video, that in their home countries, they present as straight. And so the idea that because somebody presents as straight, well, he looks straight, so I didn't have to ask about whether, he's attracted to men or women, that's invalid. Also, the fact that they are people who are bisexual. So if a person comes into our offices and a woman comes in and she has biological children of her own and is married to a man, does not mean that she's not also attracted to women or that she hasn't had relationships in the past with women. And when people come from countries where their identities are not protected and may be persecuted or penalized, criminalized, many of those people hide behind a straight marriage or a straight relationship. And so when you're taking a history, the history looks like this person is straight or that this person is cisgender. And if that's all that you're asking, then you are going to miss the part where they had to engage in those behaviors, even though that's not how they identify or feel internally. And so this is really essential. When it comes to the structural barriers, actually, going back briefly to microaggressions. For LGBTQI people, one of the most common forms of microaggressions in healthcare is the assumption that they are heterosexual and cisgender. They've actually said that. And it is well documented in these communities that they have a higher risk of tobacco, alcohol, and drug misuse, as well as sexual transmitted diseases, psychological distress, and suicide as a result of that higher prevalence of discrimination, rejection, and violence. So not only are these behaviors in our communities, our society creating the conditions by which they develop maladaptive coping strategies, but then we also are not prepared to help support and take care of them in creating barriers to help get them help to address those maladaptive coping strategies. So when it comes to structural barriers, the location is a big one. As I mentioned before, the majority of organizations set up for serving immigrants and refugees are located within the communities, and they exist kind of in silos where those communities are. And it's really important that for individuals who are LGBTQI, they may not want to access those services where the rest of their community is accessing services. There may also be an issue of language barriers. Again, if we are providing those services, but we do not have the right kind of staff or the right, like language access, then that's a structural barrier as well, which will limit people's ability to access our services, even if we are ready and able to provide them. When it comes to cost of services, the majority of people, you heard the numbers I mentioned earlier of undocumented. Many undocumented people do not have insurance, do not have a way of receiving services. Many asylum seekers also do not have the ability to access healthcare services. And so the cost of our services is going to be a huge barrier to utilization. There are organizations that receive federal funding or local county funding. And so for that would be, encouraging people to access those services. However, if all of those funds only go to community programs that serve the community, then that will leave out people who are not interested in accessing their services within the community because of fear of discrimination or reprisal in some way, or information getting back to their families in the home country. And I have worked with families where I can't talk about this with my, within the school or within the community where I live, because it will get back to my family because these many people live or come from the same town where I came from. And then the quality of care. Many people are not prepared to receive, to provide the services, even though they are receiving the funding to provide the service. And so when people access services that are not inclusive, are not welcoming, it can create more harm. And it often creates more harm than if they hadn't received the services at all. And I'm going to talk about inclusive practices to combat that. But at first, I want to mention a couple of individual factors. And some of those are stigma and internalized homophobia or shame. When it comes to stigma, the stigma is many times, again, about mental health care, which we know that immigrant families and people from different countries have different beliefs and understanding about what mental health is. And with communities who do not have a long history of preventative services, but rather only of curative services, mental health is something that only goes towards people who are perceived as crazy or people who are very impaired in their function. And so if they don't see themselves like that, then they may not be open to receiving services or they may not seek them out. And so depending on how we encounter them, trying to decrease and provide psychoeducation to decrease that stigma is incredibly helpful. The best way to access that is through outreach and in the community in different locations. And so I talk about, going to churches, going to schools, going to primary care providers, going to community centers. And I'm not necessarily talking about gender and sexuality when I'm presenting my services. I am talking about mental health. I'm talking about mental health symptoms and the ways in which not only they impact us, but they impact our children or our relationships. And people become more open if we discuss what we can do for them to facilitate the kind of life that they came to looking for here, right? So you came with the hope of being able to be productive and give your children a better life. I want to help you do that. And this is one of the ways in which I can do that. Or you came here looking to build a community and looking to build connections. Let me help connect you to other people and let me help you build healthier relationships that you can begin to work on that goal. Internalized homophobia and shame, especially if they experience trauma before coming to the United States or coming to us, which is highly likely, then they may have a sense of shame. If they come from a religious background or a cultural background where it is homosexuality or transness is frowned upon, then they may experience shame. And they may have internalized homophobia, which is the belief that they are bad, that there's something wrong with them for wanting this. And we heard that in the last interview on that video. If I could choose not to be gay, I would, right? So there is that wish to not be who he is. So what are some inclusive practices? Number one is to display markers of acceptance and inclusivity. People are not always going to know that you are inclusive in your treatment unless you display them. And so I have different ways in which I display. I have little buttons that I hang around in my office. I have this little rainbow flower that hangs. I have a few different flags. This one says strut your stuff. I have a few ones with the rainbow flag and so on. And you can use stickers, decals. It doesn't have to be anything big. These are really little things that I have peppered throughout my office so that people can see markers that it is safe. And it may not be something that they see immediately when they walk in the door, although we do have at the community mental health program where I work, that we do have little stickers that have the rainbow flag and said services for all. And so the idea is to communicate acceptance and promote the idea that we are all equal and should be celebrated for our differences. Everyone is welcome no matter what their race, ethnicity, their gender or identity or sexual orientation or any other identity status. It doesn't matter. We also show this through use of gender neutral or non-heteronormative language. This gets trickier outside of English, where there are words and languages where words are gendered. And Spanish is one of those where we have, A's typically or E's for female and O's for males, for male genders referring to men. And so it's important that we find other ways. It's easy to ask, are you married? And if the person says yes, then ask their, husband's name or what's your, wife's name, or, or how long have you been with your wife, or how long have you, are you dating anyone? Do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? Right? So there are different ways to ask this. With younger people, I usually ask, if they're really young, I say, do you have a crush or have you had a crush on anyone? Can you tell me about them? And in Spanish, I would say, can you tell me about la persona or esa persona? And so, so that is broad in the person that my client can feel open to disclosing as much as they feel comfortable with. And I pay attention to if they use any kind of gender words while they're speaking about the person, or if they don't. If they purposely leave it vague, then I recognize that this is a place where they're not ready to be more specific yet, but I will make a note of that. And if it's an older person, I say, have you ever had romantic relationships and with anyone? And if so, tell me about them. If the person is married to somebody of the opposite gender, I say, have you ever had romantic attraction to anybody other, to any person who was not of the gender of your spouse or your partner at this time? And I leave it at that. Don't assume sexual or gender identity of your audience. Like if you're speaking to someone and you don't know how they identify, don't assume their gender identity or their sexual orientation. Respect the words that each individual uses to define themselves, their names, their pronouns, their identity labels. Use those. And if you make a mistake, either in the pronoun or the name, then repair it immediately, saying and it doesn't need to be a big, long explanation about why you made the mistake. Just say, sorry, I meant, and then repeat it. Repeat it with the correct pronoun or name. And I've worked with clients, I work with adolescents a lot. And so I've worked with clients where their pronoun choice changes sometimes, or their preferred name changes at times. And we've gone back and forth and they laugh at me because I'm like, wait a minute, I know this. I can get this right. But it's because when it switches, I have difficulty sometimes switching. And sometimes it's switching back to the original, gender assigned at birth, but I'm so used to referring to them with their trans pronoun or the gender non-binary pronoun that I make the mistake, or, and they laugh at me because they know that I am making an effort. And so as long as I'm making an effort and I fix it and correct myself, then that's what's important, instead of becoming defensive. Provide opportunities for the person to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity on the registration forms. This information they may not, if they're able to disclose it early or not, face to face, it may be easier. So while they're sitting in your waiting room, and if they're able to disclose that, then that would be, filling out paperwork, that would be helpful. However, they may not disclose if somebody else is helping them fill out that form that they don't trust. So if it's a stranger, or if it's an interpreter, or if it's a member of their families, they may not disclose that information. Confront any microaggressions that you hear from your staff, from other people in the room, and even if there's nobody who is trans or gay or bi, please, any kind of queer person, even if there's nobody else in the room, please confront those microaggressions, because that is how we build a safe and supportive, welcoming environment for people once they are in there. It's not just that people will suppress their judgment and their beliefs and their behaviors, their microaggressive behaviors, when there's a person who might be harmed, but that we all feel safe, because you also don't know who has not yet come out to you, or who might be in the process of even coming out to themselves and is not fully aware of that identity yet. Be careful not to out people without their consent. So if a person has come out to you with a certain name, pronoun choice, or or sexual orientation, do not address them by that in public, like in your waiting room, until you ask them how they want to be addressed in other settings, right? So if they're not ready to be addressed, and I've had a couple of kids young adults who have come out to me, but they don't want me using that name when I go meet them in the waiting room. So I use a different name when I call them, and then we use a different name when they're in the therapy room with me. Critically really examine your own biases and your experiences, because I think that if we do have limited contact with people who are sexual and gender minority folks, then we may have certain beliefs about people that we might not be aware. And again, it's all subconscious. I'm not saying anybody's purposely or consciously prejudiced, but if it is subconscious, you will make mistakes because of lack of awareness. Don't expect your clients to educate you. Yes, they are the expert on themselves. Yes, they are the ones who have to tell you what their pronouns are and their identities are and what they mean to them, what those pronouns and identities mean to them. But they are not supposed to tell you how to help them. They are not supposed to train you on that or how to navigate certain things and challenges that they're going to face. That's your job to go become trained, either through supervision, through trainings, through reading, whatever you can. And feel free to reach out to me for additional resources if you ever have questions or concerns. And then make sure that all client-facing staff is trained to be inclusive in their practices, in their behaviors, and their communications with LGBTQI folks who come into your clinics or offices. So how do we go about intersectional healing? It starts with, and again, intersectional, because we're going to address all of the different identities that our immigrant folks come in the room with, right? And so we're going to assess beliefs that they have about their gender, about their sexual orientation, anything like that, whether it be their personal beliefs, cultural beliefs, family, how their family feels about this, how their religious background and faith feels about their identities. We're going to address all of that and assess it, because first we need to know and understand the ground where we're standing. We're going to screen for trauma, including experiences of discrimination. And so when we talk about screening for trauma, I think it's really, really important to remember that trauma, we need to ask the questions, but we don't need to go too deep early on until the person has developed the amount of trust in us. And so we explain why we're asking the questions. You can use any of the typical trauma history questionnaires. The THQ is just fine, except that at the end, I ask additional question of, have you ever been harmed or fear for your safety because of your identity as a gay person, as a Black person, as an immigrant person, as a trans person, right? So we ask those questions at the end to make sure that if there are other instances in where harm has come as a result of their intersectional identity, that we are aware of that. And we explore that later in treatment, right? The screening is simply to get a sense of the lay of the land. We're going to explore the coming out process. Where is this person in relationship to coming out to themselves and coming out to others? How much have they really explored their own identity, and how long have they sat with this? Are they at a place of acceptance, or are they still at a place of self-hate of this identity and wishing that they could change it back? Or if I had power, are they interested in seeking for you to help turn them back, or are they looking for affirming care? And even if they're looking for us to turn them back, we know that's not a thing that can happen, but we can help navigate the grief and challenge that accepting this identity in themselves is like, and what it will require. We need to provide culturally informed affirmative care. And what that means is that we're going to help them first tell their story so that we can assess the impact. People gain power over their experiences by facing the fear of disclosure. As I mentioned earlier, many people have not had to come out at all, and then all of a sudden, through going through this process of asylum or immigration, all of a sudden they've had to repeat the same story and come out to many different people that they didn't know. And so telling that story and talking about what it's been like in any instances of discrimination or harm that has come to them will be helpful in gaining their own power by being able to talk about it. Survivors can be negatively affected if those disclosures are forced, as I mentioned earlier, by, for example, in the immigration process, or met with unsupportive responses from either us or others. And so also asking about, have you ever shared this with anyone else, and how did they respond? We want to be able to acknowledge the harm for them. We want to help assess whether they are safe, and safety includes determining, whether there is self-harm and engaging in harm reduction interventions and developing a safety plan, as well as increasing their social connections to others, so that for people who are isolated, so that they can begin to feel as part of a community and develop more adaptive coping strategies and supportive relationships. We want to process grief. There's grief about what was left behind as an immigrant, the loss of the home country, the loss of family support or rejection if they have come out. The person may also be grieving aspects of their older identity or perceived privileges that they had before they identified as gay or trans. We want to address the shame and internalized homophobia that I mentioned earlier. They may blame themselves for victimization incidents. If I hadn't been gay, if I hadn't been acting so flamboyant, maybe this wouldn't have happened. If I hadn't been out trying to hook up, maybe this rape wouldn't have happened. They may also speak negatively about themselves and other sexual and gender minorities. We want to validate their anger. It is a necessary aspect of the recovery process because difficulty expressing anger contributes to shame. And shame is that anger being directed at the self. You are bad instead of you did something wrong, which again, being gay, being trans is not doing something wrong. In not being able to express anger also interferes with the grieving process because it disconnects the person from their feelings. If I am pushing away this feeling, I'm pushing away other feelings as well. And so allowing anger to come out, make clear, venting it will help to clear and make space for other feelings that may also feel uncomfortable. And we can teach our clients to express their angers in a healthy way, maybe through activism and writing or creating. There are many different ways to express anger. Advocacy for themselves. And we want to teach, obviously, healthy coping strategies, but also resistance strategies, which I think is something we don't always do. First, when it comes to coping, we want to teach culturally congruent and inclusive coping strategies, not just what has been taught to us here in America, but also in saying, well, how do people in your country, in your culture, deal with these challenges, not necessarily with this challenge, but when they're going through difficult moments, how do they cope? And utilizing some of those strategies that are congruent and that can be helpful to them in this current situation. Help them deconstruct their history of oppression and provide guidance so that they have increased awareness of healthier ways to see themselves, as well as, rather than the internalized negative messages that they received, as well as creating healthier defenses against those daily incidents of discrimination and microaggressions that they face. Some of the resistance strategies are empowering them to demand equality, including in equitable healthcare in places where they go, limiting or cutting off harmful relationships, and teaching them about boundaries and how to do them in a healthy way, with understanding, again, that they may not have the privilege because of their intersectional identities to cut off everyone. So if you have a person who is low income and has limited resources, they may not be able to cut off certain family who is helping to support them or provide them housing, even if it's causing harm, until you are able to connect them to an alternative access to resources. And so that leads me then to that affirmative care referrals, right? So we have to make sure that if we are referring people, that the providers that we are referring to are providing affirmative care, that they are not going to be discriminated against because they are gay, because they are trans, because they are gender nonconforming, that if you don't feel comfortable treating a person who is a gender or sexual orientation minority, that if you are going to refer to another provider, that you ensure that this person is in fact somebody who is an expert and is providing affirmative care. Because in 2013, Exodus International shut down and publicly apologized for the harm that they had caused by conversion, by providing conversion therapy and promoting conversion therapy. And then California, that same year, California Federal Appeals Court upheld the constitutionality of laws that regulate professional conduct that disallow specific mental health treatment and medical practices that they deem harmful, such as these sexual orientation change efforts for minors. And although the majority of the United States population live in jurisdictions where conversion therapy for minors is banned, there are gaps in protection. And conversion therapists specifically have adopted some deceptive marketing practices and strategies to try to continue to get access to minors and to other people seeking, who are LGBTQI, so that they can provide conversion therapy, although they're calling it different things. So on their websites, things that you might see is that they may specialize, they may say specialize in work with LGBTQI people, and specialize in healthy sexuality, gender identity inferiority, or sex addiction. And again, those are terms that we're all used to hearing. So why would I suspect? Because they are providing services to those people, but it's not what we believe. Some of the names or that titles, I guess, of the services that they provide may sound like reintegrative therapy or sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy. And you may not see all those words, sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy. You may see the acronym, which is SAFE-T, which is also the name of some suicide prevention model. So if I see safety, I was not going to think sexual attraction fluidity exploration in therapy. I was going to think, oh, this person is trained in one of those suicide prevention models. And that's all I would think. And so it's really important that if we are going to provide it, somebody we're familiar with, somebody that comes recommended, and not just for therapy, but the same thing when it comes to lawyers, when it comes to medical doctors, when it comes to anybody who is going to provide care to our sexual and gender minority clients. I've provided a few online resources. This will be in your handouts. I will go out to you. And Susanna, I will send you this latest one because I added a couple of ones to this. And so these are some online resources. They are fantastic for printing information. Many of them may be available in other languages as well that you can print. And I included the link for ILGA World at the bottom so you guys have access to those maps that I shared. And then some local resources in the greater Philadelphia area for gender affirming care, as well as sexuality development programs from the Mazzoni Center, Nemours, Christiana Care, and CHOP. So for that, we will stop for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jari. That was really, really thorough and very helpful. I don't see anything in the chat yet. Let me see. We do have quite a few participants. If anyone wants...
Anybody? So either I was really good or really confusing.
No, I think you were really good. I think you were very clear. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing this really helpful information with everyone. Yeah, I don't see any questions, so I think you covered it.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Take care. Bye.